Welcome to the Chief Strategy Officer podcast. This podcast and Outthinker's executive peer network provide a platform for the architects of corporate success, chief strategy officers. We enable them to collaborate and share their unique experiences in tackling complex challenges, navigating disruptive technologies, and driving impactful growth. Today's guest is Shantnu Sharma, a senior public company executive who has led enterprise strategy, transformation, and corporate development across the semiconductor and digital infrastructure ecosystems. Most recently, he was a C-suite officer at Western Digital, where he led transformation and growth priorities, strengthening planning, discipline, and improving commercial performance. Previously, he served as chief strategy and technology officer at Arrow Electronics, led strategy and M&A at AMD, including work connected with the Xilinx acquisition, and earlier was a senior engagement leader at McKinsey, focused on technology strategy and transformation. In this conversation, we move beyond the headlines and hype about AI and actually get to look under the hood at the physical constraints, strategic choke points, and value shifts that are shaping the next decade. Shantnu outlines forces strategy leaders really should be watching to understand how AI may evolve, at what pace and in what steps, such as the race to build semiconductor capacity, and why talent and execution matter as much as capital, the split between AI training and inference, and what that means for infrastructure and latency demand, why advanced packaging, which we'll learn about later, has moved from afterthought to strategic battleground, how geopolitics and supply chain choke points are redefining competitive advantage, and how AI is now changing the very process of designing and manufacturing chips themselves. From there, we explore what Shantnu calls the convergence frontier, where AI moves from digital tools into physical industries like manufacturing, logistics, energy, and healthcare. If that convergence accelerates, the prize could be enormous, potentially expanding technology companies' addressable markets far beyond software into labor, capital expenditure, and operating systems for the real world. But we'll also unpack the bear case: regulation, power constraints, integration complexity, and the possibility that AI may struggle to generalize in messy physical environments. For chief strategy officers, this is a conversation about scale, capital discipline, bottlenecks, and value capture. It is about understanding not just where AI is going, but who captures the upside and why. Let's dive in with Shantnu Sharma. Shantnu, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much. I'll be honest with you. I have prepared more for this podcast interview than I probably have for any other podcast that we have recorded. And I also feel the least prepared.
Excellent.
Right now, there's so much hype about AI. You've been in the space, especially at the hardware stack side, and observing it. So what are just a few things which we watch out for over the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. And thank you for that shout out. I've been in this space, both from the hardware side, but also substantially, from the software middleware side. But let's start with, a little bit of a semiconductor reality check. And look, what I'm going to tell you is at this point, fairly non-controversial. And I'll maybe surface 5 things. The first one is fab execution. There are a lot of announcements. And the question really will be, who can deliver capacity on time, on budget? Because, there are constraints in materials, equipment, talent, and the broader ecosystem, particularly as we pivot to a North America-based foundry ecosystem.
Gotcha. How long does it take to build fab capacity?
A good rule of thumb is, 2 to 3 years.
Mm-hmm. And what takes the time? Is it the physical infrastructure? Is it the people? What I've seen is that hiring people and finding people who can do it well, recruiting them and retaining them is a big barrier too.
Yeah, I think in North America, talent is a big barrier.
Yep.
For the longest time, this talent ecosystem pretty much migrated from North America to Asia, but it's coming back. So that's a long lead time item, but several organizations are fixing that.
What is it? Why is it so hard? What can't we just hire someone and just train them and give them 3 months of training and they can just do the job?
Look, I think I don't want to overstate the problem because it is a problem that can be solved. And hiring, training are definitely the right things to do. But the reason this is an interesting problem is, first of all, you think about a factory environment. And to run a factory efficiently, there's a lot of operational know-how, particularly for a factory that's, very, very specific to semiconductors. So I think that's one bucket. Then there is the aspect of making sure the factory runs in the most optimal way. And that's again where past experience plays a big role.
Okay. So it's more of an experience challenge rather than, say, some kind of like behavioral or cultural challenge. Okay. All right. That's I get you. That's solvable. What about number two after the fab execution?
I would say number two is that AI-driven demand is driving a lot of investment on the leading edge. A lot of times you hear AI and generative AI is a lot of investment needed in compute. But what is happening today is it's not just investment in compute, it's basically pulling the industry towards leading edge nodes.
What do you mean by leading edge?
Yeah, what happens in semiconductors is with every generation, the size between transistors continues to shrink. So you're packing in more transistors. Transistors are kind of like the building block. You're packing in more transistors into a smaller and smaller footprint, which makes it for, faster, more power efficient, but more expensive to build.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this AI demand requires that cutting edge or leading edge node.
Just so we understand the AI demand, and you and I preparing for this, I came to realize that there's two different types of AI demand. Can you explain that?
Yeah. Let's maybe try to answer this in the paradigm of ChatGPT, since that has become such an integral part of our day-to-day lives and our culture.
Yeah.
Before I can use ChatGPT, there is some work that's being done in the background, using special algorithms that are influenced by neural networks. The smarts behind ChatGPT is learning. It's going through a lot of data and understanding patterns and thinking about how it can use those patterns to uncover more patterns. That's what it's doing. It's not happening in real time as we're using ChatGPT. It's already happened, before we use the tool. That's training.
That was surprising to me, just just as a user. I just thought that it was constantly learning from me, and then understanding that it's almost like you go to college.
Yeah, that's right. It went to college.
And then you applied your learning.
But when you're using it, then it's basically dipping back into what it learned in college and giving you an answer. Or, if you're driving in a car that has AI built into it and it recognizes a stop sign and stops, it's using its past knowledge to make a decision. That's inference.
Okay.
But remember, the line between the two is not as sharp because it is actually also learning when it is helping you. And then it gets a little bit more technical than that.
Okay. And the demand for the learning is more spiky. That happens like intense periods of times, where the demand for inference is more even. Or
I would say right now the demand for both is high and evenly high.
Because we're training so many
That's right.
models.
That's right. And by the way, that kind of also surfaces another point, which is there is data center capacity needed to service both these models, right? The training and the inference. And traditionally, training happens at massive scale. Hyperscalers do this. They'll probably look for space where they can, optimize for big facilities. But for inference, often there is a fair bit of sensitivity to latency. You ask a question, you want an answer quickly. So that results in a different choice point for the data center because you want it closer to where you want the answers to be provided. So those are things that are kind of like interesting for us to kind of put in context, because as we later on go into physical AI, there's more inference happening. The compute capability needed to support that has to be close to where that's happening.
Yes. Yeah, I want to get into how we're going to experience the physical implications or the physical interaction of AI. We're starting with what kind of the physical constraints. So given these physical constraints of what AI, whatever, adoption, development, whatever. What do you think the next battleground is?
Look, packaging used to be.
Could you just explain what packaging means? I now think I understand, but most of our listeners won't.
So if you open your laptop, you'll see a board and there's a whole bunch of electronic components stuck on that. Several of these electronic components are silicon devices, and they just look like a very tiny rectangular block. But for this tiny rectangular block to communicate with the rest of the world, it needs to be connected to it. And that's where packaging comes in. Kind of like a glue that you kind of slather all over a silicon device, which then lets it plug into the electronic ecosystem. And it solves problems of connectivity, thermal, and so on. Packaging has become more specialized and more interesting because traditionally, semiconductor companies would create, a device to do a job. But now what they are trying to do is they are creating a constellation of devices and stitching them all together. And this stitching now is done as part of the packaging. So this used to just be an afterthought. Now this is now part of the actual design cycle.
But I thought chip design is the primary skill. Like that's the main event.
It still is. And now you can think of it as there's chip design, but the chip designers have to now work very closely with package designers and think of an advanced solution that combines those two worlds.
Love it. All right. So we've gone through 3 of these. Any more that we should be aware of?
I would maybe surface a couple more. The fourth one I would say is supply chain and geopolitics. Every industry wants to manage its risk, but now as we are thinking about export controls, geographic concentration, choke points, maybe in packaging, perhaps in critical materials, these things perhaps can determine, which enterprise will scale, which enterprise will be successful, and who will not be. And then the fifth one I would say is AI inside semiconductors, because AI is now improving how chips are designed as well as how chips are manufactured.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take this to its logical conclusion, then you'll see faster engineering cycles, better yield learnings, better quality. And there's a school of thought that says that we can actually expand effective capacity by leveraging more AI in addition to building new fabs. If I can be smarter about how I use my assets,
Okay.
then I can get more out of it.
Oh, so generally, I'm oversimplifying here. We have this burgeoning demand from training, from applying. We can manage that. Then we have supply. And with supply, we have new approaches and technologies. We also have the geopolitical, where do we place it? We also have the training, the pulling together of the atoms to build these things.
That's right.
And, what we've heard about is the scale of some of these places where they do the training, these training campuses, that they actually look like campuses, rows and rows of buildings the size of football fields. I watch CNBC, that's the question is how quickly and where do we build? But I've also heard skeptics say that maybe we're overbuilding. What do you think?
Look, anybody who can answer that question with high precision probably will make a lot of money. But let's just maybe take a step back and kind of break this down. We should separate training from inference. Training tends to concentrate in large, very large, power-dense sites. Inference tends to be a little bit more distributed. Again, it also requires a lot of power because many inference use cases are latency sensitive. Not all, but many of them are.
Just to help us visualize, give us an example of a latency-sensitive inference case.
I like to use the example from automobiles. When you're in a self-driving car and it's making decisions, that's latency sensitive.
Perfect. We don't want to wait 2 minutes for it to realize it's a stop sign.
And also when you're using an AI tool and it's helping you with the prediction or interpret data, there's only so much you are willing to wait.
So does that mean that we start seeing, kind of edge embedded computing that fills in that mid-ground from the campus and the what's going on in my car?
Yeah, so let's just maybe think about 2 very contrasting endpoints. Massive campuses, probably in areas where land and power is plentiful, particularly land.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got the other endpoint where you're building capacity, which is very close to major metro areas, there's a term called co-location where different providers are like in the same building. And you now have this ecosystem with these two anchor points. They're all interconnected. And I think there's kind of like a spread in the middle as well.
So, but do you think that even with this segmentation and having this kind of middle ground of this co-location, I'm picturing on the kind of edge of cities, can centers be built fast enough, do you think, to keep up?
Well, the constraint right now is power. Look, the grid was not originally designed for what we are seeing in power spikes from AI. And then there are non-traditional solutions that are emerging that may or may not be helpful, but it'll take a few years for them to reach their logical conclusion.
So it's almost like a race, right, to keep up with this demand, and that race has to bring together land, people. You have to do the permitting, you have to provide the power, you have to do cooling, packaging, chips. It's like this assembly of this whole supply chain. Where do you see in the next 12 months, as we're recording this in 2026, where do you see the specific cracks in the supply chain emerging?
So the way to think about this is as we kind of run through the supply chain, at different points, different aspects of the supply chain become interesting because all of a sudden the industry realizes there is potentially a soft spot. So over the last 12 to 24 months, there was a lot of chatter about advanced packaging. Today, there's a lot of chatter about power. There's a lot of excitement in the market, a lot of tailwinds for memory and capital equipment. But when you hear tailwinds, you can also think of that as bottleneck. I think it's almost like this thing keeps on moving and, it's just exposing that it's one vast value chain. And as we discover, soft spots, then the industry kind of comes around to doing something about that problem. And then the next soft spot surfaces.
Mm-hmm. Are there any metrics that you think we should keep an eye on as kind of early warning systems of where the choke point or tailwind?
Yeah, it really depends on where you are in the ecosystem.
Okay.
So enterprises are doing this today. As I talk to my peers in the industry, like depending upon their own unique situation, they're watching, specific stress gauges and then making business decisions based on where they land. But a great example, which has been in the news right now, is DDR4. I mean, it's memory technology that's been around for a little bit, big install base, but there's a lot of discussion about shortages there, and supply is having a difficult time adjusting. So for something like that, a good gauge would be, hey, can I just watch the gap between spot and contract pricing?
Mm-hmm.
And if that starts to widen, then you know that the pressure is building. Because what you're looking for is, is there a specific component that's problematic? Or is a larger collection, a system of components tightening? Because that would be a bigger problem.
Okay. So interesting to dig in deeper on the shifting supply chain gaps. But I'd love to take us forward a little bit. Let's say that these constraints that we figure out, power, packaging. Now, let's just imagine, assuming that these get solved or at least managed, what do you think the world looks like? I've heard you use the phrase convergence frontier.
Yeah. Look, the convergence frontier is where AI straddles the digital and the physical world. The lines between simulation and reality, the lines between data and manufacturing, software and machines, these will all start to blur. And you'll see a lot of people talk about, hey, AI is getting physical. That's exactly what they are talking about.
Can you give us an example to help us visualize, like, say, on a factory floor?
Yeah, and why don't we start with the semiconductor factory, because we talked about that earlier. So if you walk into one of these fabs, again, very sophisticated operations, but you'll see there are vision systems, and these vision systems will flag tiny defects. And these defects are important to flag and fix because otherwise they result in a device that's faulty down the road. But the step function improvement, the convergence frontier improvement really happens when AI steps in and closes the loop. So it takes that defect and takes it back and creates an upstream process change, or maybe changes some parameters in the manufacturing system. Then it takes these changes and tests them first in a simulation environment. And when it's comfortable with the output, then it pushes them maybe in a beta environment and then into mainstream production.
I got it. So now AI is not just checking lines, checking quality. It actually becomes like the process engineer. It actually organizes the rectification.
It does. And I would say there are two things there that become interesting. The first one is that every little shift is a learning cycle, and AI does not forget. So every anomaly that it finds, every correlation that it leans on, every fix, it just accumulates. Look, humans are great and they're brilliant, but at the end of the day, people go home, they take vacations, shifts change. AI it's never forgetting.
Yeah. Give us another example. I know you spent time in distribution. Maybe that would also help people visualize these scenarios.
Yeah. Another example where you have fairly large and sophisticated infrastructure. And I'll relate a personal example. I watched a picker race a robot. So, picker is the individual who's kind of like fulfilling demand, like they're grabbing the devices that need to be shipped. Now, this was a, slow plodding robot, but the robot won, not because the robot was faster. The robot won because the robot had already anticipated the next three picks.
So it knew the future. It was better at predicting the future.
Yeah, it's almost like it, in quotes, knew the future. But what it really is doing is, as constraints are changing, it's adjusting in real time.
Uh-huh.
And it doesn't really know the future. It knows a probable future that's based on order patterns, inventory positions, real-time demands, right?
Yeah,
And I think in this case, the convergence frontier, the convergence leap really happens when, an AI agent can coordinate the entire operations end to end, adjusting in real time as constraints change.
Mm-hmm. This is fascinating because what I see is it's not just about like installing conveyor belts and just getting more efficient. It changes the inputs that can go in and how the factory can adapt. It reminds me a little bit of, we had Richard Devaney, he's a professor, and he wrote a book about 3D printing. This was kind of before the public excitement of AI. And he was saying, what is a company that is a 3D printing company that one day produces bikes and the next day produces pens and the next day produces, but it's sort of like the factory becomes this adaptable thing. And that, if I think about that, then these kind of ideas like in the popular media of these $10 trillion valuation companies, because you're not looking at a TAM that's sort of like more narrowly defined, I can kind of see that, but it still sounds like that's a little bit of science fiction. That's a little far way off. What do you think?
Yeah, it does sound like science fiction, but let's go through this journey step by step. We were in a world where, software slash technology and operations were separated. You build the technology, you deploy it, then it becomes operations, and if it needs to fix it, it goes back, tells the engineers, we need the next rev. But in the examples that we're already seeing, what we're seeing is software, operations, and AI are becoming inseparable. And it's not about installing conveyor belts and barcode scanners. It's about this entire AI-driven end-to-end operations lifecycle. So you're already seeing that shift.
Yeah.
Now you take that a step further, and we think about the science fiction $10 trillion valuation that we hear about. And there are quite a few enterprises today that have, single-digit 2 to 5 trillion dollar valuation. What would we have to believe for it to become a $10 trillion company is how I would phrase this.
Uh-huh.
And really, it has to be that these enterprises have to expand from traditional tech into value pools that are far away from traditional tech. Just as operations expanded from operations to operations and software and AI all combined into one.
So what I hear you saying is the budget that they're targeting isn't only the tech budget, that it's also labor, CapEx. Is that what you're arguing? Yeah.
I think that's one way to think about it. You could say, hey, today I'm a technology provider or a technology solutions provider. In the future, can I be a platform that will help industries convert labor and capital into output a lot more faster and efficiently than
Yep.
they're doing it today?
Okay.
Now, that's a big leap. And, now I start thinking in terms of global GDP. like GDP in the mid 2020s is, 120 plus trillion dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take this leap and we believe that AI is deeply embedded in physical industries, manufacturing, logistics, energy, healthcare, then the question that I would ask is my addressable market just software and silicon spend? Or is it, in addition to that, a big, meaningful slice of labor, CapEx, operating spend across the rest of the economy?
Interesting. Let's stick with this $10 trillion number, and their TAM is much broader than what we think of it right now. And they start taking this slice of labor and CapEx, and they're doing it across healthcare, energy, manufacturing, logistics. But those industries have like pretty thin margins, and they've got incumbents that have experience, they're slow. Are those industries that this company, this future $10 trillion company, will be motivated to go after? Will their margins come down?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. We just have to look at the journey that enterprise software took from on-prem to cloud. When I hear that $10 trillion number, my first reaction is, look, it's not a prediction. I think of that as a boundary condition.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of things have to make sense and have to be true for that valuation to become real. And timing becomes critical. And if, the adoption is going to take 25 to 50 years, so this, convergence frontier is 3, 4, 5 decades away, then, the net present value of those benefits are not that much.
Yeah. Then maybe you can't justify a 10 billion when it's going to take 25 to 50 years. So what's the bull case? What's the argument for it won't take 25, 50 years? It'll take 10 years.
Yeah, and we should talk not just the bull case, but also the bear case, because look, at this point, nobody knows. And if I put that physical AI lens on for a second, I would say for the bull case, two things come to mind. The first one is you can inject AI and all the benefit that it provides without having to substantially change the physical infrastructure. So if I can keep my conveyor belt and just add stuff to it, make it smarter, that's great. If I have to replace it, that's a problem. The second assumption would be that workforce labor will continue to be expensive and difficult to find. So there is a desire to kind of work around that shortage and invest in AI and technology. And look, there are people who will say, is that really true given all the potential workforce issues that AI can create? We're seeing that a little bit in software development. And then on the flip side, if I were to argue the bear case,
Mm-hmm.
I would say, look, physical industries are regulated for a very good reason. There is safety, there's liability, there's environmental impact. It's one thing to have a chatbot that you're using on your phone or your laptop, but in this case, AI decisions are impacting people and equipment, and they will face scrutiny in a way that chatbot on your phone will never have faced.
Yeah, so is the case with many big technology-driven transformations. It's not just about the technology working. It's the go-to-market is a grind.
Yeah, the go-to-market is a grind. The integration is a grind. And organizations that have strong balance sheets and patient capitals, they will have an edge because they can afford the long game.
Yeah. So let's say the company that is able to unlock the stakeholders and realize this $10 trillion, what do you call this company? Is it a tech company?
I would say it's a patient company. It's playing the long game. It continues to be anchored in technology, but it's almost like it's building now an operating system for the real world.
Okay. Unpack that for us. What do you mean an operating
Look,
system for the real world?
you're casting your net wide.
Yeah.
You're not just selling a chatbot. You're casting your net wide into transport, energy, healthcare, manufacturing. You're selling powerful decision-making, automation in the physical world, complete loop, building on top of what already exists, staying in the right regulatory lanes, so on and so forth.
That's interesting. And that's one reason why these more kind of capital-intensive hardware businesses, in addition to the moat that they provide, that's maybe the real reason why they suddenly matter.
Yeah, look, and you also have to think about where is it that AI is touching reality. All of a sudden, sensors and cameras and robotics and power electronics, these are things that are controlling the interface between AI intelligence and the physical world. And in the past, they had a very narrow technical role to play. Now they're becoming AI enablers. They are vital components in that journey from, the single trillion valuation to the 10 trillion valuation.
Fascinating. So
Yeah.
they're not just winning in tech. They become the infrastructure, the platform, the operating system for manufacturing, but then for government and for civilization.
I think that's right. That's the prize. Yeah.
And then what happens to those who don't seize that prize?
Well, they become they become low margin vendors or the ones that seize the price.
Fascinating. I'm going to ask you to take the devil's advocate on your argument over here. These few companies that seize the prize, that we solve packaging, power, infrastructure. What's a weak link in your own thinking?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of uncertainty. We may be overestimating how fast these feedback loops will close. Because if these close, slower than what a lot of people are anticipating, then that's a problem. But
Yeah.
let's get very specific. So, today we're using tools that are driven by AI models. They're working well. Can these models generalize really well to really messy and very high variance physical environments?
Mm-hmm.
Because if they don't, then what would happen is for them to close these loops, every loop is a special case. It has its own custom tuning, its own custom technology stack. Then the scaling economics doesn't work. So you just have a series of expensive projects and becomes a services business, not a platform business. Very valuable, but not transformational.
Right. Not really. Yeah. Not a scalable platform. Because just to bring this, the way I'm thinking of it is right now an LLM can work with me and work with you and work with my mom, and it doesn't have to change much. But because the factory's layout is different and the machines are different and all that, it has to just be reconfigured, retrained or whatever, then it becomes, a digital consultant.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right.
Great. So first potential weakness is it is not general. And so it doesn't become platform-based, it becomes a service, which is less scalable. So what's the second potential risk in your argument?
Look, I think the second one is going back to power and energy. I've said power is the bottleneck. I've looked at it very, very carefully. I know it is. But since you're asking me to kind of think deeply about the other side, I would say the question that I should be asking is, are we underestimating how fast new power solutions are coming online? Is there a disruption in power that will bring capacity online much faster? If that happens, then it's not about who can secure power. It would be about who can deploy capacity the fastest.
Not about who can secure power, but who can deploy power the fastest.
That's right. And it's a risk to incumbents who have built moats around power access.
So say that again. There were some beeps.
Sorry about that. It's a great example of convergence between your various end devices. I was saying there are incumbents today who have basically built competitive moats around being able to access power. But if you're an insurgent who is maybe locked out of that conversation today, all of a sudden these new power technologies can make you a player in the game again. It's not that power will be less important. It's just that who wins can shift a little bit.
Got it. The trends will continue, but who benefits is the uncertainty.
Yeah. AI is going to make changes in physical industries.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are two uncertainties here. The first one is, will these changes be transformational from a value capture standpoint? Or will it just be incremental change that happens over a long period of time?
Mm-hmm.
Step function or gradual. I think that's the uncertainty. And the second uncertainty would be, who is going to capture the value? Is it the incumbents? Is it insurgents or somebody else? I don't know. But look, change is coming. Physical convergence is real. And AI and physical together will make a big difference in several industries over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Fascinating. I think you framed it up perfectly. That's a great place to end. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and think this through and lay out so clearly for us the opportunities, the constraints, and the possible directions. think that you're onto something really important, that it's kind of what's under the hood that people aren't talking about right now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shantnu.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Chief Strategy Officer podcast, where we explore how today's strategy leaders are navigating growth, complexity, and change, keeping their companies ahead of the pace of disruption. If you enjoyed this conversation with Shantnu Sharma, please subscribe, share, and leave a review. To join a community of peers leading strategy and transformation across industries, visit outthinker.com.